Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with our first lecture, which is an introduction. So I'm going to pull that up right here. Okay, so again, what this course is the Introduction to Peace and Security Studies, as you can see here. So some of the things that we want to do in this course, or some of the objectives that we have, are to first develop an understanding of the U.S. foreign policy process. It's easy to think about the United States as a unitary actor, right? Just think that the United States makes decisions and that the United States is a thing. But what is important to remember is that whenever we think about a state, what do you think of? You may think of the Capitol building, you may think of the White House, but those things don't have agency. Those things don't make decisions. People make decisions, right? So we want to think about how the people of the United States make foreign policy decisions. And that's more complicated than you might think, because in theory, the United States is a democracy. It was set up to be a democracy. So what that requires is that the will, the opinions, the insights of hundreds of millions of people are put together, aggregated up, and somehow come up with some foreign policy output. So we want to talk about how that process plays out, right? How is it that the U.S. foreign policy process plays out? And how is it that the United States foreign policy emerges out of a country of 350 million people, roughly? What we then want to do, that's going to be our first block, where we talk about the institutions of the U.S. foreign policy process, and we think about how policy is both made, designed, and then implemented. That's our first block of instruction. Our second block of instruction will examine we'll start to take a theoretical understanding of the causes of conflict in the international system, which are the causes of war, the causes of violence, and causes of mass violence. We want to be able to understand those. That will be our second set of instruction, and then we'll have a midterm on that, and we'll leave that. And then our third part of the course will start to examine the place of the United States in the current architecture of the international system. The United States is really in a very unique position in the world system. And I can say that both as someone that has been raised in this country, raised in the United States, and also as someone that has significant ties to India, which are where my parents are from and where I have many relatives and where I've traveled to several times. And I've had the good fortune of traveling outside the United States in many different contexts. And no matter where I've gone, the United States is a topic of discussion. The United States has enormous influence over the world and throughout the world. So it's important to understand how the United States got to that position and where that power came from. And it's weird in a lot of ways if you think about it, right? Because most of you have grown up thinking that the United States is just in that position of power, and that seems very, very, very normal. But let's put it in a bit of perspective. Today, and basically consistently since 1945, the United States has accounted for 5% of the world's population. And yet the United States' influence over the rest of the world's 95% of the population is outsized, right, is enormous. And for better or for worse, that's the way things have been over the last several decades and look like they will continue to be, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, something to bear in mind also is that no country has been in that position, no power has been in that position and stayed there forever. So one of the things we do want to talk about also, in addition to just understanding what the United States is, what tools it has to bear, how it makes foreign policy, how it reacts to this very, very difficult problem associated with international conflict, and how it's dealing with current challenges, what we also want to understand is this idea of change. And I want you all to think of it that way, right? Most of us, when we go through high school, don't think about change. We think the United States is powerful, is going to stay powerful, will always be there. But again, and that may well be true, but again, remember the pattern. Historically, no country has been in the position of the United States and stayed there forever. So we want to think about, if there is dynamic change, if it's possible for what we know of to change, what would that change look like? How would the United States change with it? And how would the United States adapt, right? How would we see changes in the United States, and how can the U.S. foreign policy establishment adapt to a dynamic world? Because that's exactly what it is. It's dynamic. So those are the big questions we're going to have sort of in the back of our heads as we go through this course. But first, we want to talk about how the United States makes its foreign policy. Now, something that's interesting is that early on in the history of the United States was something relatively new. right? Most of the world's powers, most of the world's states, right, defined as an entity that has a territorial boundary that's supposed to have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Most of the world's states were monarchies or were autocracies in some way. So when the United States conducted its democratic experiment and tried to allow for some public input into public policy, and it wasn't complete suffrage, right? It was limited suffrage. Women were not allowed to vote, right? People of color were not allowed to vote, right? It was white males that had property were allowed to vote, but still, nonetheless, that was some extension of the franchise to people, right? And before it was basically just particular elites or hereditary elites that had power. This was something new, right? Most of the system consisted of limited democracies, monarchies, or dictatorships, whereas in the US position, farmers had input over foreign policy, which was not something that was typically done. Right now, that was something that was looked at by several observers as being something that was dangerous. Right, in a famous study, Alexis Tocqueville looked at the United States and said that this is a dangerous experiment that the United States is engaged in because the large mass public is relatively ignorant, which is going to be a subject of discussion today on the discussion forum. His argument was that the mass public didn't understand foreign policy, was ill-equipped to handle foreign policy, and therefore putting the mass public in charge of foreign policy was something fundamentally dangerous. I would assume most of you would disagree with that. I happen to also disagree with that, right? Because if we think about it, the way I look at it oftentimes is when there's a critique about the US public and saying that they're ignorant and they don't understand things. They may well be ignorant and not understand things, but that's not because they can't understand things. It's because they're busy, right? Most of your parents, many of your grandparents, many of your relatives, many people you know from wherever you came from, they're very, very busy and they don't necessarily have time to focus on all the intricacies of foreign policy. I do. I happen to have that time because that's my job, but most people don't. So many people I know, for example, are doctors, right? They have something to say about public policy, but they're not necessarily as well researched because they're understandably busy, right? Same thing with lawyers, same thing with engineers, same thing with anybody, right? Anybody that is working, right? Auto manufacturer, for example. When I was at the University of Michigan, I happened to work in the cafeteria with many, many people that had been laid off from auto plants or that knew people from auto plants. They just don't have time to really investigate everything, every detail about foreign policy, right? So it's not that people are ignorant, it's that people don't have time, right? That's the way I would put it. But regardless of that, the idea that ordinary people had influence over any foreign policy, that was seen as something that was dangerous. Now, that's no longer novel, right? The idea of public opinion, public influence over foreign policy, that's not novel. When the United States was first founded, there were not that many democracies in the world. In fact, the US was the only one. And then gradually over time, more countries started to go through and adopt more democratic institutions, but still democracy was relatively limited until the end of World War II. Right, and after World War II, we saw an expansion, a plethora, a growth of the number of states in the international system. And many of these states started to adopt some form of democratic institutions, even though many of them backslid after that. States at least aspired to have some democratic institutions. So the democratic experience in foreign policy is no longer novel. What is still novel, though, is the US set of institutions. Most democracies that are out there in the world today are parliamentary democracies. They have systems like proportional representation. The US doesn't have that. The US has a set of institutions that are relatively unique amongst the major industrialized democracies. And so the US conducts its foreign policy in a little bit of a different way. The US system specifically is a presidential system. Most of the world's major democracies today are parliamentary systems. And the US has a system that has embedded in it checks and balances. That is rare, right? It's there for a reason, though. The founding fathers of the United States were deeply skeptical of centralizing power in the hands of one monarch or one executive. So they broke it apart, right? They made it hard to conduct foreign policy. Whenever you get frustrated at foreign policy in the United States, something to remember is that if it looks like a leader can't get something done, if it looks like a leader is ineffective, it looks like they can't make things happen, that is the intent. That's not necessarily the product of a leader's incompetence. It can be, right? But oftentimes it wasn't intended to work. What the founding fathers of the United States designed was a system that was incredibly status quo biased. And think about why they did. They were property owners. They were upset about taxation. They created a system where an executive would have a whole lot of difficulty trying to change the tax system and take more of their property. That was the point, right? So it's difficult for anything to actually work in the US system by design, right? That's intended to create limited government, right? So the criticism of the US system is that it's inflexible due to this checks and balances system, right? There are changes in the world. Things happen in the world. The world is a dynamic place, and yet the US system has difficulty responding to it because of this checks and balances system. That's one critique of it. Another critique of it is that because it is democratic, it's really hard to understand what it is that the US wants, right? There are many, many different leaders in the United States. So the executive, the president is one, but the president is constrained by congressional leaders, right? And that's also constrained by the federalist system of the United States, where governors have some influence. Governors often go on trade missions and things like that. So a criticism of the United States is that there's just too many leaders, which makes it really hard to understand what's going on. And then a final critique that's been voiced against the United States over time is that the U.S. foreign policy lacks both consistency, right, that things can change, right? When you have a shift, for example, from President Obama to President Trump, attitudes rapidly shift in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. And it also lacks credibility, right, because decisions today can be overturned by leaders tomorrow. And again, you can see this in the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, where commitments for the Paris Accord, et cetera, were overturned by the next administration, by the subsequent administration. Now, another critique, and a big critique of this that we've discussed, is that there's too much public influence over foreign policy. The way monarchs looked at this is that they were designed to prevent peasant rebellions. The thing that monarchs, after the Peace of Westphalia, which was the system which was the agreement that created the modern interstate system, what they were deeply afraid of was a peasant revolution, right? And then the French Revolution really showed them how concerning that the peasants were. But the United States is something that, in the minds of many of these monarchs, was led by the peasants, right? It was led by those individuals that were not monarchs, that were not of hereditary blood, right? And the concern was that they were ill-informed, they were fickle, they could potentially undermine consistency and the predictability of U.S. foreign policy, and they weren't equipped to deal with foreign policy problems in a serious way. And so what that has led to today is a critique that American foreign policy is overly idealistic, right? And leaders seem to care more about principles than they do about maintaining the true dynamics of the system and the balance of the system and dealing with each other. That American foreign policy is driven by these ideals like democracy and like human rights, et cetera, that are not necessarily consistent with maintaining stability in the international system. So a question to ask yourself, and I think this is worth having a discussion of, are these critiques valid? In foreign policy and public policy just generally, my opinion is that it's a bad idea to think of things in absolutes. It's a bad idea to say that the US is an inferior system or it's a superior system. The way you can think about it is trade-offs. There are likely some things that the design of the US system allows it to do better than other countries, but as a result of that, there are some things that the US does not do well, right? So you want to think about the trade-offs, think about the things that work well, think about the things that don't work well. So keep that in mind as we go through the first part of the class, right? We're going to talk about the internal foundation of US foreign policy. And I want you to have these critiques in the back of your mind as we go through this, so we can consider, is it the case that the United States is inferior or superior? Or what are the trade-offs? Where does it lie on these spectrums? So to do that, we're going to adopt these wide variety of approaches. We're going to adopt try to use some insights from anthropology, sociology, history, economics, and political science. But we want to, and for the first part where we study American government, most of that's going to be political science. What we then want to do is to move into the second block where we try to scientifically understand conflict. Now, this is important because a critical part of trying to understand something as emotionally laden as conflict is to try to do it scientifically. What I don't think you want to do is to just say conflict happens because people are power hungry, people are greedy, right? Let's think about that. If that were true, people have always been greedy. People have always been power hungry. Why do we only see some wars at some periods of time? And more importantly, if it's true that wars are driven by power-hungry leaders, why don't we see it more? War actually empirically is quite rare, right? If we define it properly. right? If we just say war is any armed conflict, war would be happening all the time. But I don't think that's what you typically think of as war, right? So what we want to be able to do is to understand what exactly do we mean by war, and when do we see that phenomenon happening. Now, in order to study it scientifically, there's a couple of key reasons to do that. One of the reasons is to try to remove our biases, or at least make them as transparent as possible. My guess is for many of you, it's going to be, and for me especially, it's going to be impossible to completely remove our biases, right? We have grown up in a world where wars are a big part of our experience. For many of you, the war on terror is a big part of your experience. And so it's going to be hard for you to remove those biases that you've grown up with completely. It is for me. My background, again, is from India. It's hard for me to remove many of the biases that have been beaten to my head as someone with my background for a long period of time. But this is where science can help us, because what science is supposed to do is to be at least transparent, right? If we have a bias, we should make that clear in our work, right? We should make it clear what we're assuming in our work. From my background and my research, I typically assume people are rational actors. I make it clear that I'm making that assumption, right? And I don't try to hide that assumption. I make this as transparent as I can. So if I have a bias to treat people as rational actors, I'm being transparent about that. I'm letting you know that that's true, right? And so in order to, since this is a way we can help try to study the phenomena, is at least we're being transparent in what we're assuming, right? And if we use scientific study, we're transparent with our assumptions, and we try to study them based on those assumptions as objectively as possible. So let's think about it as an example as to how science may help us, right? So let's think about the question of nuclear weapons and deterrence. So for a long time, the argument was that nuclear weapons can help deter, right? Nuclear weapons are useful in trying to deter foreign threats. So several scientists examined all identifiable cases of international crises, beginning in the 1800s to the 1990s, to see, do nuclear weapons actually provide any deterrent value? And consistently, these scientists found that nuclear weapons did not prevent crises from escalating to nuclear war. And so that suggested that nuclear weapons had no effect at all, right? If we examined all the international crises and saw cases with nuclear weapons were just as likely to escalate to an interstate war as cases without nuclear weapons, that would lead us to the conclusion that nuclear weapons are useless. But what's going on here maybe is that we're suffering from selection bias, right? So if we only look at the crises, we're basically neglecting the decision by states to actually enter into crises in the first place. And that's a strategic decision. So if we examine, based on this theoretical study, both the cases where countries make the decision to enter into crises and countries make the decisions to escalate crises, then we see something different. What we see is that countries are less likely to enter into crises if their adversaries had nuclear weapons. But once they enter into crisis, they've already made the decision that they've already made the calculation that they should do that, despite the fact that their adversary had nuclear weapons. So if we examine it from the crisis on, nuclear weapons don't affect the likelihood of escalation, but nuclear weapons deter countries from actually entering into crises in the first place. That's a problem known as selection bias. But that's where theory is really important. If we only look at the cases where we see nuclear crises, we're committing problems of selection bias. If we only look at crises, we create problems known as selection bias. But this is really important in trying to understand the problem. Nuclear weapons can work as a tool of deterrence, but if a challenger starts a crisis despite the presence of nuclear weapons, they've already factored into those nuclear weapons and they don't care, right? And so therefore nuclear weapons don't have any effect on escalation from crisis to war, but they do have a great effect on preventing crises from materializing. So there are a wide variety of approaches we can use to try to study these conflicts scientifically. We draw on anthropology, sociology, history, economics, political science, etc. So we'll try to touch on as many of these as possible, right? And the goal of this is to try to develop a scientific understanding of how conflict works in the international system. And we then want to apply this to our understanding of U.S. foreign policy and several of the crises that the U.S. faces in foreign policy, and discuss the future. So what we're going to discuss in the next video is how the U.S. starts to make foreign policy at a very general level. We'll then narrow down on the different institutions that the U.S. has to make foreign policy. So that's going to be in the next segment. This segment today is going to have 4 videos, the intro and this one. So I'll stop here, and then we'll start to examine some of the key ways that foreign policy is made.